welcome to Socrates in the City, Oxford edition. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you, please. Please take your seats, please. I am really thrilled to be here. I keep saying that the bank robber, Willie Sutton, once was asked, why do you rob banks? He said, that's where the money is. And people ask me, why are you coming to Oxford? That's where the speakers are. There's so many people here that I've wanted to interview for such a long time. And so this is my chance. We're going to be hearing from one of them tonight, Dr. Ard Louis. Now, let me say, if you're unfamiliar with Socrates in the City, it is an interview series, a chat show, however you want to think of it, sort of long form, where we get into, the bigger questions. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, and then he blew his brains out in an alley. I don't know if you realize. All right, cut. No, so he said the unexamined life is not worth living, and I thought, New Yorkers in particular lead unexamined lives. We shy away from the big questions, just they make us uncomfortable. So I say Socrates in the City is conversations on life, God, and other small topics, right? So whatever. It could be sort of, that pretty much sums up, everything, right? Sort of on everything. But we try to go for the big questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? We don't always do that, but I would say more than half the time. So tonight, we will get into the world of science, faith to some extent. We have as our guest Dr. Ard Louis, who's a professor of theoretical physics right here at Oxford. He leads an interdisciplinary research group studying problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. You got to be pretty smart to do that. He's also director of graduate studies in theoretical physics. From 2002 to 2010, he was a Royal Society University Research Fellow at Cambridge and here at Oxford. Prior to this post that he has at Oxford, he taught theoretical chemistry at Cambridge, where he is also director of studies in natural sciences at Hughes Hall. He is also an associate of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He's written for the Biologos Foundation, where he was on the board of directors. In 2013, he was elected a member of the International Society for Science and Religion. He was born in the Netherlands, was raised in Gabon. Is that how we pronounce it?
Yeah.
Close enough. And received his degree, I'm an American, so and received his degree from the University of Utrecht and his PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell University. And most notably, he engages in molecular gastronomy in his free time. If you don't know what that is, join the club. I will ask him. I have some ideas, but please, a warm Socrates in the City, Oxford welcome to Dr. Ard Louis. Come on up. Thank you. Welcome. Come on. Have a seat. We've got free water for you.
Free? Yes,
yeah, free water.
And free is good.
I want to ask you, I feel like anything I say, you're going to turn into, like when I say free water, I think you're thinking of free radicals or something. I've got my science cap on, which is it's a tiny cap, so don't worry.
Not bad for free water.
It's really tiny. It's really tiny. We met, a year ago, and I just had an immediate, wonderful conversation with you. I think we know some people. We do know some people in common, and I love talking about science and faith, how they relate, how they don't relate, and you struck me as sort of the perfect person. So when I came here, I was really hoping you'd be here this summer, and you are. So thank you for being here and for consenting to be part of this series. My first question is, what is your story? How does somebody, you're born in Africa. Tell me about that and how you get to be here at Oxford.
So I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa, where my parents still live. My parents are biologists, so I grew up with a lot of science around. Grew up with had a pet chimpanzee as a child, explained some of my behavior.
You grew up with a chimpanzee?
I did, yeah.
Haven't we all? No. Well, first of all, by saying that your parents are biologists, that doesn't really explain what you're doing in Central Africa. What are you doing? How does your family end up being in Central Africa?
So my parents wanted to do some kind of missionary work, having just come to faith a few years before as students.
Right.
And they went to teach at a school in the middle of the jungle, essentially. And then they stayed on. My father stayed on as a botanist. He's a plant specialist.
You're raised in the middle of nowhere, effectively. I mean, I've heard you say this, I guess, on a video or something. I was fascinated because you're describing a tremendously remote location.
Yeah, so we lived in a place where you'd have to drive half a day for the nearest town which had shops. And it was just kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was a school that the local villagers would send their kids to for secondary school. So the villages were off on waterways, not very easily accessible. So they would send, once the kids finished some kind of elementary education, they'd go there as a boarding school. So you grew up in the jungle, lots of food around in the forest, lots of animals, very fun. I mean, for a kid, it's like heaven, basically.
And both your parents are biologists.
Yeah, they're both biologists, yeah.
That's extraordinary. So, I mean, you grew up in this environment of obviously faith, because they care about that, otherwise they wouldn't have gone there, and science. This is extremely rare in my understanding of the world. You don't typically find people who, first of all, you know, in the world in which I live, there may be one parent who's a scientist, but for both parents, that's, you know, it's pretty rare. But for them to also be motivated by faith and then to be serious scientists, it just seems like a fascinating environment. I mean, this idea that you're in the middle of the jungle in Africa, and that you're growing up in an environment where faith is taken seriously, but your parents are both serious biologists. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like a kid's dream. I mean, to be in that sort of environment. It just seemed, I mean, to have a chimpanzee as a pet, that's not typical.
No, it's not typical. No,
So-
no, it was great fun.
You actually enjoyed being part of this community.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
You
I felt
did.
very much part of the community.
Okay.
I felt very much like
So did you know from when you were very young that you would be a scientist?
I didn't think about it too much when I was young. At
Did you
some
think
point-
everyone was a scientist?
Yeah, I thought it was just a very ordinary thing because my parents were scientists.
Yeah.
There is a story my parents told me, I don't quite remember it, but apparently when I was in my teens, I told them I need to sit them down and had a very difficult announcement to make to them. And I told them I didn't think I was going to be a biologist, I was going to be a physicist. And I was sure
Wow.
they'd be very disappointed.
Yeah.
So I must have been one of
That's when parents know they've really failed.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. When the kid doesn't want to be a biologist.
Yeah.
And what could be worse than physicist? That's just
Exactly.
horrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really sad. I hope my daughter would never make such a claim to me. It's funny. I mean, it's serious because but it is also, of course, funny that you knew at a young age, okay, I have to tell my parents that I'm in love with physics. Now, how does it come to be that, how old were you at the time? I don't know.
14, 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does it come to be that, you know, at that young age, you know you want to be a physicist?
When I first encountered physics, I just loved it. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I still think it's incredibly cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought it was so fascinating that I thought it'd be amazing if I could do this for the rest of my life.
So far, so good.
So far, so good, yeah. Although I've moved into biology, so now I spend a lot of my time doing biological things. So that's why my parents have brought it up. Saying,
Yeah, well, I want to get
can
into
run, but you
that,
can't hide
and I want to
from
get
this.
into the molecular gastronomy too, because I love anything interdisciplinary. I think that one of the difficulties of our age is people get so focused that they can't speak to people outside of their discipline. Sure. So I love that, and I want to talk to you about that. But okay, so you know early on that you have an affinity for physics. You want to be a physicist. What happens next?
So I go to university.
Yeah.
I keep studying physics.
In Utrecht?
In the Netherlands, yeah. So I go back to the Netherlands, study physics.
Now, when you
liked it.
grew up, were you speaking Dutch at home?
Yeah, so we spoke Dutch at home, and it was a French-speaking country.
Yeah.
But I went to an English-speaking school for part of my schooling, so I had a bit of a mixture. And so when we lived in the village, I also spoke a local language, but I've lost that. So
What was the local language?
Banzabi, it's called.
Wow.
But I can just say hi now.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad. I've lost it.
Well, it's amazing. But your parents are still there.
They are, yeah.
Gosh. You go off to university, and at that point, what was your ambition when you were an undergrad?
So I think my ambition was just to learn about physics. I wanted to learn. I thought it was really fascinating. I didn't know, I was hoping to have a career in it, but it's quite competitive, and I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to. So I kind of took it one step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Did a PhD in the US. Really enjoyed that.
Oh, where?
In Cornell University.
I missed that. It's not in my notes.
So then I went to Cambridge, and so just one thing kind of led to another, and I ended up as an academic. I mean, the interesting thing is that when you're an academic, right, you get paid money to think about things that you're interested in. In fact, it's other people's tax money, which I say thank you very much. And you're in some sense paid to think about what you think is interesting. A kind of
Right.
curiosity-driven thing.
Right.
You may think that's odd, but most of our really great discoveries have come from that type of curiosity-driven research. So it's a great job. Basically, you're being paid to think about what you think is interesting. And there aren't very many jobs where that is the case,
Right.
you know, where you're basically
Right.
given that kind of freedom to explore. So it's a great thing. I'm really, really pleased.
Right. And so now you've taught physics here, but you taught biology at Cambridge?
Chemistry.
Chemistry. Now, how's it possible? I mean, that's very impressive, the idea that you could be teaching at this level in those two disciplines. That's got to be a very rare thing.
Well, there's lots of places where they overlap. And once you know one, it's not that hard to learn the other one. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not that big of a deal, obviously. Yeah, okay, so I'm not as impressed now that I understand it. All right, so in this rather rarefied environment here, teaching physics at Oxford, having taught chemistry at Cambridge, have you ever encountered, or do you typically encounter, or did you encounter when you were younger, a difficulty in reconciling your faith with science?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes and no. So I think that when you study science, it's so beautiful and intricate and exciting that if you're a Christian, it strengthens your faith. You look at it and think, man, this is amazing. And there's something, so the content of the science, in some sense, attracts you towards God as a sense of worship almost.
Right.
So I've had that experience from the very first time I started learning science. I just thought
Really?
it's amazing.
So as a kid?
Yeah, just the beauty of it. I thought, wow, that's really cool. So it's a bit like if you ask somebody when they go out into nature and they see these beautiful mountains, does that make them doubt their faith? Well, no, it doesn't. It's the opposite effect. So even though it's harder to explain to a layperson why it's beautiful, it's definitely at least as beautiful. It's the most beautiful natural scene. On the other hand, I think science has a kind of a psychology around it, a certain way of looking at things, which can be very corrosive to faith.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, in science, I have a very particular way of thinking about the world, which is I look at things that are controllable and repeatable.
Yeah.
And that's very different in some sense from the way I might think about my Christian faith, because God might do stuff that's not controllable.
Right.
And so you can get a kind of way of thinking about the world that tries to put everything into boxes and tries to control everything. Right. Which I think it's more of a psychological state, and that can be quite different. I mean, it's actually also bad for interpersonal relationships. So, for example, the classic, let's say that your wife comes to you and says, I've got a problem. I don't know if I should choose A or B. And the scientist's answer would be, well, which is better, A or B? And if they're the same, that doesn't matter. And if one's better, choose A, one's better, choose B. Right. Well, that's a classic scientific argument. But that in personal relationships, that doesn't work because things are more complicated, more nuanced. Right. And so I think it's really that kind of psychological stance that can be corrosive to faith. Mm-hmm. And so it took me a while to realize that was what was going on. So I'd be spending all the time in science thinking in a very particular way about the world. Yeah. And I'd step out of it, and I'd have to broaden my horizons a little bit. Yeah. And well, but difficult.
I guess what I was talking about earlier about your parents, the idea that you grew up with very serious scientist parents who were serious about their faith. So in a way, they already modeled this idea that there's no division between the two, or there's no hostility between the two, that they are just different ways of looking at the world in a way, but not so different that they're opposed. They're not in different camps. They can be related. And I guess Francis Collins, he spoke at Socrates in the City some years ago, and he talks about how once he came to faith, what he saw as a scientist made him marvel at God. Yeah. And you don't hear that very often, but clearly...
Well, you should hang out with scientists more.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. So clearly you don't hang out with scientists.
But I'm saying what I hear from scientists, part of what I'm saying is already, but there's a cultural narrative that has evolved, for lack of a better word, over the years, that has established this idea that there's a science culture, there's a scientific worldview that somehow actively excludes God, but historically that's not been the case. I know you studied the history of science, so tell us about that, because that's another thing that people may know a little bit about science, but typically we don't know much about the history of science.
Sure. yes, there's a cultural narrative of science and faith being opposed to each other, something that's called the conflict myth. And, but it's not really the experience I'd have here with my scientific colleagues. So in physics, the physics department, I know at least maybe 20 of my colleagues who are very serious about their faith in the sense of going to church regularly, and we meet once a term for dinner to talk about these things.
But that's astounding. I mean, I just want to pause there and take this in. I mean, the idea that here there would be 20 colleagues in the physics department who are fairly serious about their faith, that's big news. That's sort of headline news in my universe. You don't expect that. I have heard that physicists, more than other scientists, for some reason, seem to be faith-friendly or deists or something like that. But to actually hear you say that, to confirm that, that's rather dramatic. I don't think the world knows that. Part of the reason I want to do this is to say that people need to know that because we bought into this, what did you call it? Conflict myth?
Conflict myth, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So the conflict myth is, what's actually interesting about the conflict myth is how powerful it is, given how little evidence there is for it.
Yeah.
And I don't really know why it's the case. But so historians of science, that's where the word comes from, and they've created that word because they think it's a myth, because historically the way that science and religion have interacted is not conflict. It's been complicated sometimes, but by and large, religion has helped the development of science. Many great scientists in the past were religious, very deeply religious, Newton, Maxwell, Faraday, etc. And today that's still the case. So the facts are different from the public perception. Now I think what is true is that the kind of popularizers of science, say the Sagan, Dawkins, etc., they often, I don't know why that is. It may be because the reason they become popularizers of science is because science functions as a kind of religious worldview that they're trying to evangelize others with. Makes them good popularizers of science. It makes them sometimes bad philosophers, and makes them promote this kind of idea. So I think that is, so it's one of those kind of funny things where it's not true on the ground among practicing scientists. It may be true among popularizers of science, but that's very different from scientists, right?
Well, yeah, and again, that's part of the reason I wanted to talk to you, because I thought it's fascinating, you know, when you live in the world and you're not a scientist, you're not an academic, you would get that impression. It's a very strong impression. It's overwhelming impression. But my experience over the years reading, getting to know people, I realize it's nonsense, but everyone believes it. And it seems to me that it started definitely with Darwin, that debate. I mean, that, you know, half a mile from here, Thomas Huxley debated Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, this famous debate in 1860 right here. That, in a way, was like the precursor to the Scopes trial. It's like this cultural event. People talk about it, they argue about it, and then the Scopes trial in Tennessee, same kind of thing. It creates a popular narrative that pits people of faith against science.
So the thing about those stories is that the Wilberforce-Huxley debate, the vast majority of stuff that's popularized about it is almost certainly apocryphal and not true. So it was a much more subtle interaction. Wilberforce was, you know, quite careful in what he was saying, and vice versa. So, and the same is true, in fact, of the Scopes trial. So Ed Larson got a Pulitzer Prize writing about it. And basically showing that a lot of there's a film in the US called Inherit the Winds. Which is
it's nonsense.
Largely apocryphal. But these things nevertheless get spread a lot. So, in fact, so historians of science often put the origin of the conflict myth to one of the famous writers is one of the founders of Cornell, Andrew Dickinson White, who wrote a book called The History of the Warfare Between Science and Christendom, in which he had like a history of all this conflict myth. Most good historians would say that the book is largely bad history, but it's been incredibly popular, and it's kind of pushed this kind of that myth along. So the interesting question is, why did bad history, bad retelling of stories, why did it have find such a fertile ground to grow? And I think that's I'm not a sociologist or a historian. That's a really interesting question. And so my experience is that people often say to me, "Oh, it's so strange. You're a serious Christian and the scientists." but that's because they've been fed a certain kind of popular narrative which is incorrect.
I think probably what happened, I'm neither a sociologist, but it seems to me that what happened is that science gave a language or let's say a side, it gave a worldview to those people who were bothered by the worst of religion.
Sure.
In other words, if you were raised in a fundamentalist environment that was very religious, very harsh, very rigid, the idea that Darwin and his disciples had finally come up with something that you could wield against, what H.L. Mencken called the bourgeoisie, these know-it-all religious fanatics. That's really what I think happened. I think that before that, there was nothing for those people to grab onto in the same way. And it was also empirical. I mean, it's one thing for somebody like a French rationalist, deist, to be an enemy of religion, but now there was this kind of proof. There was something hard or whatever. So I think that, I'm guessing that that's really the first time that happened and people grabbed it.
Possibly played a role. I mean, religious people have done lots of silly things, right? So you can see why people might be offended and find that attractive.
Yeah.
In practice, these stories are always much more complicated. It is interesting that this myth is so powerful and that it has such a strong hold on our public imaginations, given that it's incorrect.
Is that part of the reason that you have some of these conversations? I know the organization that you're affiliated with, the Faraday Institute, is to sort of bring some dialogue to this?
Bring some dialogue into this, yeah. Try to push back a little bit on that myth, but it's a lot of hard work because people really believe this stuff.
Yeah.
So science is very powerful, and it's probably the most powerful, most amazing thing that human beings have invented as a cultural form. And so it's natural to look at its methods, which is a method where you look for things that are repeatable or controllable in some way, and to say, well, this method delivers reliable knowledge about the world. And given that it delivers reliable knowledge about the world, perhaps anything that it can't pronounce on is therefore just shouldn't be taken seriously.
Right.
And at the surface, that seemed like a reasonable kind of thing to say. You don't think about it a little bit longer, and you realize that's a kind of nonsensical thing to say. Even the people who say that can't live their lives that way.
That's right. Yeah.
But
don't. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in fact, I think the reason why, if we use science and religion kind of debates or talks, it attracts a lot of people, not because they're interested in the intricacies of science, but precisely because they think that science brings us reliable knowledge. So that's a really important question. How do I know something's true or not true, reliable, unreliable? That's really important. So maybe science will give me answers to all the kinds of big questions that I worry about, like how should I live?
Right.
Why am I here? What's the purpose of life?
Right. Well, but the funny thing and the irony is that people who define science very narrowly, right? Or actually, I mean, let's say, if somebody says, what is science? Science can comment on what is within the universe, right? It can talk about what's in the universe, and that's what it does, and it does that extremely well. Yeah. But most of us have questions that go beyond those things. Yeah. We want to know, is there something, for example, beyond the universe? There's something beyond time and space. Sure. If there is, that would be beyond the realm of science. Sure. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to speculate on it. And we can even use science to help us figure out what might be beyond science.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a good. So let me just try to give you two examples of things that are important but beyond science. Okay. So let me ask you, so let's say that you want to know what's the value of a human being. Right? That's a really important question to which everybody has an answer of some type or the other. It informs our legal systems, our international politics. It's a really, really important question. Yeah. So how would you use science to define the value of the human being? Well, if you're facetious, take chemistry, I'd see how many gold fillings you have, and that would probably be the most valuable thing in your body. But that seems silly. Yeah. If I was, a psychologist, I might measure your IQ, but that seems very wrong. Yeah. If I was a sociologist, I might measure how the community thinks about you. Again, that all seems very, very narrow. If I was an economist, I'd measure how much economic output you make. Sometimes it feels like that's how we're measured. But we all realize it's wrong. In the end of the day, none of those disciplines tells me the really important question, which is, what is the value of a human being? Yeah. That question comes from something outside of science. Right. And the point is that you can't just say, well, science can't answer it, therefore it has no answer, because you can't live life
Right,
way.
but some scientists who I would describe as scientistic
Yeah, sure.
scientists, that they've fetishized science to the point that they say if science can't answer it, there is no answer. In fact, it's almost indecent to look for an answer.
Yeah,
and so
but
they're trying to bat away those kinds of inquiries, which again I think of as tremendously narrow. It's funny because it's almost a fundamentalist kind of attitude, except regarding science.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's fundamentalist. I don't think anybody really lives that way, so it's just philosophically naive. But there's many examples of that type. So that's one example.
Yeah.
Another example would be, let's ask ourselves, why is there something rather than nothing? So why you look around at this universe and you wonder,
That's
why
kind
is
of
it
a big
there?
question.
Well,
That's
big
a
question.
real Socrates in the City
Yeah,
question.
big question. So why is it something? So you could say, well, okay, one possibility is that, let's take our universe. Why is our universe here? Well, it could be that, something caused our universe, right? And then you say, okay, great, so that something caused our universe, and so what caused that? Well, something caused that. So maybe I should not look at our universe, but just say, why are the laws of nature there that allow the universe to exist?
Okay, now
Yeah?
this is easy for you, but just slow down a tiny bit, because even asking a question like that, I mean, these are huge questions.
Sure.
First of all, why is there something rather than nothing? Even trying to really grasp that question. Most of us don't ever go there, so to speak. We assume that there is something rather than nothing. To suddenly realize that it needn't be that way hurts the head, right?
Okay.
The idea that there is something rather than nothing, and yet it really is the question of questions. Then, what was the second piece?
So I was just saying, so maybe I should, so we take a step back. To me, I've wondered about this since I was a kid, like why is something rather than nothing? So,
No, I didn't mean not to get
Yeah.
into that, but I'm saying I'm fascinated. You asked that question. These are huge questions.
Questions, yeah.
And then the question is, why are there
laws of nature.
laws of nature?
Yeah.
What
So-
a question. What a
so-
concept. Because again, most of us who are not scientists, I don't think we really get that. Like, why are there laws of nature? Why does math work? Those kinds of things. That's a very high level question.
Okay, so slow me down if I'm
Well, just a
going
little
too
bit,
fast.
just
Yeah,
to
sure,
to at least appreciate. That's quite a question, because most of us take those things for granted. We can't imagine there not being laws of nature. In fact, maybe it's appropriate that we can't imagine them. It's like trying to imagine the universe not being here. On some level, that's not possible.
It's hard to do. Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to imagine being unable to imagine.
Yeah.
It's not really
It's not
possible.
possible. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Try to imagine that you not really exist. Don't really
Trying to
exist.
imagine you have no consciousness.
Yeah. It's hard to do.
It doesn't work because. Okay, we covered that. But but go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, so I think, one possibility would be that the laws of nature were caused by something else, which was caused by something else, which is caused by something else, and you get into this infinite set of causes, right? So it's perfectly possible. There's been an infinite set of causes, but there's nothing in science that we've ever seen that's like that. So it's something outside of science. So that's one perfectly legitimate possibility.
Right.
The other possibility is, well, the laws of nature popped into being out of complete nothingness. So not out of a quantum vacuum or something, but just there was nothing, whatever that means. That's the thing it's really hard to imagine, but there's true ontological nothingness, and the laws of nature popped into being. That's another possibility. If you're a materialist, you more or less have to take one of those two possibilities as being true. But
And doesn't that require faith?
Well, I mean,
if it's not based on empirical knowledge, how do?
well, it's
the idea that
something
you-
metaphysical, right? Something outside of science.
Right, but I'm saying that's a pretty fantastic concept that a materialist has to be anti-materialist for a moment. His assumption is really not based on something that you can
Well,
derive.
that's exactly. So they have no choice. There's no way you can think about this question without stepping outside of science. And so there is no view outside of science that could I mean, science can help you think a little bit about what it might have looked like.
Right.
But both those two options are completely outside of science.
Yeah.
So the third option, which is the kind of traditional option of theologians, say Aquinas and others, would be that there is a being, a necessary being, who cannot not exist, right? Who's outside of space and time, who willed or created what we see. And that's also, as strange as those two other options. But the point is, all three options are strange, and you have to pick one of them.
Yeah.
So we're all in the same boat, that just a priori, we've got three strange options. And the minute you realize that, then you think, okay, there isn't somehow I'm rational and I do science and you're irrational because you think there is a God. No, all three options are strange, very peculiar. And that is a hint that there might be something more to the world than just the way we see the laws of nature currently acting. And I think, if you want to say there's nothing but the laws of nature, either they came into being out of nothing or they've always been, then be my guest. But then you have to realize that's really strange and that you've taken some kind of step of faith. I don't like to say step of faith because it sounds almost pejorative. You have to make what's a very strange assumption. And so, if you...
But I'm saying, going with that assumption requires, for lack of a better word, a kind of faith. Operating on any of those three assumptions requires something that people may be made uncomfortable by that word, but what else would you call it? If you don't have evidence for it, you have an instinct that says this is the one.
Yeah. No, maybe another way of saying this would be to say there are many aspects of the world which are non-empirical. And one of them, I just gave you this example of the origin of the laws of nature. Mm-hmm. The other one I tried to explain to you was what's the value of human life. There are other things, like for example, the existence of mathematics is a non-empirical thing. So this exists whether or not I measure it, it's out there. Right? So there's other things of that nature that are not necessarily empirical in the sense that I measure them by a scientific method, I take them to be true. So the minute you realize that, just kind of philosophy 101, then suddenly a lot of options are back on the table, and you can try to think seriously about which of these options makes the most sense of the world, which is the most reasonable way of thinking about the world. But you have to answer these big questions. Right?
Yeah.
You can't pretend that they don't exist.
Right.
And so what happens sometimes is that my scientific colleagues do have answers to those questions, but just they haven't realized that they've made them. Mm-hmm. And then they wrap themselves in the mantle of science and then pronounce on their metaphysical assumptions as if these things are buttressed by science, but they're not.
Well, this brings up something that I wrote a book called Miracles, and I didn't expect to get into the fine-tuning of the universe or anything like that, but I found myself thinking about that in some ways the greatest miracle is our existence, the fact that we exist, however you look at it, just the existence of the universe, and then the existence of us in the universe, this planet. Absolutely fascinating. No matter what your conclusions are, you have to be fascinated when you start looking at it. And the idea that, it seems to me, I guess Christopher Hitchens was asked, what is the most compelling argument of the other side? And he said, without a doubt, the fine-tuned argument. Okay. This idea that there are so many necessary conditions, that this welter of various necessities mounts up and up and up until it becomes preposterous that it could possibly just have happened. So he says this, and he says, and I'm sure that most of my colleagues, on the atheist side would concede that that's the one that stops us most, right? So when I looked at it, I thought, that there's no doubt that this is, it's so compelling. How could people reasonably think that this just happened? I think people kind of get into sort of strange, Baroque kinds of arguments against it. But the simplest one, which is maybe the most popular one, is the multiverse theory, which struck me as comical ultimately, because there's no evidence for the idea that, the multiverse theory just being that, this universe is perfect and everything's perfect to make this universe exist, but that's only because there's an infinity of universes or a multiplicity of universes, so many that one of them had to get it just right, and we just happen to be in that universe, lucky us. So, but I thought, it really is, I feel embarrassed for people who would have to reach for that. And I guess I was just wondering, do people talk seriously about that? It just seems to require infinitely more faith than believing in the other side.
So that's a lot of points. So the first thing is that, the fine-tuning argument is very interesting.
Yeah.
What it basically says is that if I change the constants in the laws of physics that we currently know by tiny amounts, then the universe becomes sterile for life. And some of these arguments are really quite striking. So perhaps my favorite one, partially because of the man who discovered it, Sir Fred Hoyle, was a very adamant atheist, is this idea that, where do heavy elements come from? So we have hydrogen, helium at the beginning of the universe, but they're kind of chemically boring. So where does carbon come from, and oxygen, and all those kinds of things? Well, it turns out they're made in stars. So the sun takes hydrogen, bangs them together, makes helium. If it keeps doing that for a long enough time, then it's got just heliums left, and the heliums whack together, and they make heavier elements. They basically whack them together and they stick. It's fusion, like the fusion reaction, like the hydrogen bomb is the same principle. So that's great. So Hoyle's thinking about this. Okay, how does that work? So how do you get carbon? Well, it turns out that you need 3 heliums to whack together to make a carbon. And so he looks it up in the nuclear data tables, and it turns out that if you do the calculations, it's very, very unlikely that 3 are going to stick together. They're going to fall right apart. And so he thinks about it, well, but it must happen. So these 3 heliums have to whack together and stick to make carbon. Otherwise, there wouldn't be life. And so he calls up his colleague, Willie Fowler at Caltech, and says, there's an energy level in the carbon nucleus, an unstable energy level, that's exactly at this particular energy because you need it for these heliums to make carbon. And I know it's there, go look for it. And they, it's a crazy Englishman, right? And they go and look for it, and lo and behold, exactly at the level that he predicts.
And what is that called? The level of what?
It's called a resonance. This technical word.
Resonance. Okay.
It's just an energy level. So these things have quantum mechanical energy levels inside the nucleus, and this is one that's an excited one, which means it's not normally populated.
And he was saying it needs to be precisely this level for the 3 of them to come together.
Exactly. And if that doesn't happen, if that wasn't that way, then what we would have is a universe with no carbon, no oxygen, and therefore chemically sterile, and be a very boring universe.
We wouldn't even have planets.
Oh, probably not. Yeah, we just have a bunch of hydrogen, helium floating around, and that would be it. It'd be pretty boring. So that's kind of interesting. That's really cool. In fact, he said this discovery severely shook his atheism.
Yeah.
So he said that, although it didn't. He said, you remained a quite convinced atheist the rest of life, but it shook his atheism because it looked like a super intellect had monkeyed with the laws of physics. So that's really interesting. So what you can do is you can show that if you change the laws of physics a little bit, then you go back to sterile universes again. And that's definitely very striking. Now, the argument would be, well, why did that happen? And a theist might say, well, maybe because God made it that way, which I think is a perfectly good and legitimate argument. But I want to not hold on to it too tightly, because the other thing, if we look around the universe, what do we notice? Well, the universe is really big, right? It's not just big, it's unimaginably big. It's so big that you just can't imagine. There are 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and there are probably about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. So the number of stars is just hyper-astronomically big. So God seems to like lots of stuff, right? And so who's to say that he didn't want to make lots of universes? Maybe he made lots of universes, right? That would be a cool thing to do.
Sure.
In fact, why not, right? So, in some sense, the idea of multiverse theory is that maybe some laws of physics would lead to many, many universes. That doesn't necessarily fix your fine-tuning problem. So the idea is you have many universes. If you have enough universes, then at least one of them by chance will have life. But if I have a lot of things, so let's say I have a lot of odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7. There's an infinite number of odd numbers, but none of them are divisible by 2. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. So if I have an infinite number of universes, it doesn't mean that any of them will have life in them.
Right.
Just like that would be like having an infinite number of odd numbers, none of them divisible by 2.
Right. Yeah.
So there has to be the right kind of multiverse.
Right.
For a multiverse to have universes that make life.
Right.
But I want to be careful about it because maybe. Well, there's a famous scene in Lewis's Lost Battle where he has this picture of heaven, and one of the things is you go over this mountain pass, and then there's another valley even more beautiful than the next one, and it keeps going on forever. So maybe it's like that. So.
Well, that's the thing, is it's perfectly possible, but to pin all your hopes on that, it just gets a little silly because it's as outlandish as saying the God of the Bible did it. I mean, it's.
Yeah, exactly. So what the fine-tuning argument helps you show is that science itself doesn't necessarily point away from God at all. It may point towards God.
Right.
And I think the more important point is that where we get into trouble all the time with science is that people extract metaphysical, theological implications from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the fine-tuning argument allows you to do is it allows you to clarify that that's what you're trying to do. Right? And so it's good in that nature.
Right.
But I'm personally a little bit more of a skeptic of this kind of natural theology. So natural theology is I look at nature and I extract theological knowledge.
Right.
And I'm skeptical about it because I'm not sure how easy it is to look at nature completely in this kind of, there's no view from nowhere, right? So as a Christian, I look at nature and I see God all over the place, in the beauty of creation, in the way it hangs together.
Yeah.
In fact, that reminds me of, you mentioned Francis Collins. So in his book, right, he talks about how he became a Christian. For those who don't know, Francis Collins, the very famous scientist who decoded the human genome, head of the NIH, the world's most powerful scientist currently, who became a Christian from atheist background in his 20s.
Yeah.
So in his book, he says he's walking through the mountains and he sees his frozen waterfall. He said, at that point, I couldn't resist anymore. And he falls on his knees and he gives his life to Christ. Now, Francis Collins doesn't think that frozen waterfalls are miracles that need some kind of divine intervention to make.
Right.
They're just the laws of chemistry, which is what he studied for his PhD.
Right.
But you see something so beautiful, so incredibly amazing. And as a Christian, you look at it and it tells you something about God.
Right.
So there's a very famous saying by C.S. Lewis, which I'm sure others have quoted you before. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
Yeah.
So I think the way we look at these things is to say, starting from the point of view as a Christian, by it I look at and it makes sense of everything.
Yeah.
And the point is if I look at nature, I look at fine-tuning, I look at the unreasonable effects of mathematics, I look at the beauty of frozen waterfalls, and by it makes sense. I can see why the world would be that way, why the world would be beautiful, why there are laws of nature that have this incredible diversity.
Right.
Whereas if I start from the assumption that there is no God, the universe just popped into being out of nothing or has always existed, then why would it be that way? I have to make another assumption. Well, maybe the world just happens to be that way. There's a whole bunch of things that don't seem to make sense to me. So it's almost like as a Christian, I can look at nature and I can weave a tapestry together of threads that become a really strong kind of cloth that I can really hang something on.
Right.
And if I start from the assumption that there is no God, I've got to ask myself, so why are the laws of nature regular? Why can I understand them? Why do they generate this incredibly vibrant and interesting world? Why isn't our world just covered with, brown sludge and that's it? Right? Why is there even this beautiful world? These are really profound questions that make a lot of sense if you assume there is a creator behind the world. But if you don't, then you've got to just say, well, that's just the way it is. And so at some point you have lots of, that's just the way it is. It's not very satisfying.
Well, also even the question of beauty. I mean, you say somebody finds a waterfall beautiful. What does that mean if we are just, collections of atoms or cells and that we have no purpose, there's no God, then even the idea of beauty becomes meaningless, and anything transcendent, love, becomes meaningless. It's just a social construct that has no actual value. It's just, so I think that if you were...
It easily becomes that way. I guess denuded of its power.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you're being honest about it, it's difficult to be honest about it if your point of view is that there is no God, and on and on and on. To really live that way, I think that you have to, I would say, borrow from a kind of faith worldview. I mean, this idea that love matters, that people matter, that there's such thing as beauty, that I can be moved by beauty, by love, that all of those kinds of things, I feel like it's slightly intellectually dishonest to say, I want all that stuff, but I also believe that the universe is meaningless.
Yeah. I want to be careful, not call people, people have all kinds of reasons for the things that they believe. In my extended family are a lot of humanists who basically say, well, we take the human as something very special, and we just assume that's true.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I'd much rather have an atheist who's a humanist.
Yeah.
Even though I think it's a kind of,
Oh, I mean,
it's a kind of fideism.
I agree, right? But I'm saying, but I just don't know how you get there. So if people need to assume those things, I would say fine.
Yeah.
But I would also say, at some point, don't you wonder why you care about those things? Isn't it interesting that you care about those things?
I think that's true. So I think maybe people borrow it from religious backgrounds. They borrow it from somewhere else. I think people also have very strong internal instincts that tell them that human beings are valuable, and so.
But that's what I'm saying. Where does that instinct come from, and why does it feel so right?
Yeah, those are really interesting questions.
Some people would say, well, it's a social construct and it's meaningless. Evolution has produced this in a way to perpetuate the species, but there's actually nothing behind it except for that. Yeah. And I think most people would find that very hard to believe. They'd say, I don't know. I think there is really something there. Yeah. I don't know what. But
I think that's right. So that's a very strong intuition that we have.
Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things is to do the exercise and think, what do we do with that intuition? Because we have that intuition is very clearly, spread across different cultures, and people very strongly feel it. And so you could say, well, I've now given a kind of mechanistic explanation for maybe an evolutionary one or some social one,
right.
And this explains it, but it also explains it away. Right? It kind of erodes it away. But it's possible. But you could also, if there is a God behind this world, then we might expect this God to implant in us certain instincts that push us towards things that are true. And certainly in the Christian understanding, that's how we think God operates. So I think it's a really interesting point. And I think that in some sense, people who want to be hardcore materialists need to think through very carefully what the consequences of that are. Partially because of my own extended family's interest in these humanist ideas. I really value them. I think that it's important for us to preserve that. But I worry that its roots are weak, and so that it's vulnerable to refutation, and also vulnerable to, in the heat of battle, in a very difficult situation, to start being cut. So sometimes it's a little bit like, a cut flower. So a cut flower is very beautiful, but it's no longer attached to any kinds of roots, and eventually it will wilt. So it's all fine and well to say, well, evolution gave us these certain instincts, and that's why I want to be nice to you, because that's something that for cultural or historical reasons has given the instinct. But once I realize that that's the case, then I've also explained it away, and if at some point it's no longer convenient for me to do so, then why should I?
What if evolution just gives me a sense of the tribe and makes me a racist and makes me want to kill people who are unlike me? Yeah. I would argue that if evolution were to do anything on its own, it probably would do that more than it would cause peace and harmony among people that are, or between people that are different. So
it's hard to know, right? But let's say that it did do that. Right? Then on what grounds would we say that that's wrong?
Well, that's the point. Yeah. That's the point.
But I don't want to just say, okay, therefore, people who are materialists are bad people, because many of them, including my family members, are very, very moral, deeply moral.
Of course,
people. I just think that on a longer scale than my own life, but the way societies move, I worry about points of view that are not well undergirded by some very profound thinking. And I think that, I don't want to say that too facetiously, but I think that some of these humanist ideas, as beautiful as they are, they're just a kind of fideism, right? I believe them because I think they're beautiful, not because they have any kind of deeper roots. And so the other possibility as a materialist is just to say, well, we should just bite the bullet, a kind of Nietzschean type of point of view, and just say, well, all that kind of morality is get rid of it, and
that's the point. I think that
if
you're intellectually honest, it moves in that direction. It can move in that direction,
and that's a worrying thing.
What you have to, But the funny thing is, I think that if you point that out to people, most people would get it. They would say, I couldn't live in a universe where might makes right. I couldn't live in a universe where there are actually no values. That's repulsive to me. Well, then you say, well, but why is it repulsive to you? Let's talk about that. Doesn't the repulsiveness of those ideas lead you to think maybe there's something more. Wouldn't that be a good clue?
That'd be good, exactly. I mean, on the other hand, people have also, Christians have sometimes done lots of very stupid and bad things, even though they should have known better.
Yeah.
Right? But at least you can say they should have known better for the following reasons.
Right, for the following, right.
Yeah, and
right.
so I want to be really careful and say that, my materialist colleagues, many of them are, really wonderful, sacrificial people.
Yeah.
And some of my Christian colleagues, are difficult.
Would you share any names with us? We won't,
Yeah, exactly.
Not many people will watch this. Just one or two names, if you don't mind.
Myself included.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, but I think as a kind of, materialism itself has a very, very weak, doesn't say very much about how we should live, about any of these important questions. And I think any kind of thoughtful materialist realizes that. But what that does is that doesn't necessarily say that therefore Christianity is the right way of thinking about it, but it does tell you that you have to find a way of thinking about it that tells you the answers to questions like what's the value of a human being, or what's the purpose of living, or how should we be together as a society. And those are questions that unfortunately those are not questions you can ignore either. You have to make a. And so that's the great thing about Socrates in the city, is that an unexamined life is not worth living. So a lot of people live unexamined lives, and they've picked up ideas about these things from the environment around them somehow.
Right.
And once you make them think about it a little bit, it may clarify things.
Yeah, I think thinking's a good thing.
Okay, good.
So
it's always worth.
I believe goodness is a good thing. And believing in goodness is a good thing. Okay, infinite regression. So I want to leap to the beginning of time and talk about, actually not quite the beginning of time, let's just go back around 4 billion years to the primordial soup.
Okay.
Do you believe that, does it make rational sense that out of what's been called the primordial soup, life would have come?
So there's no reason why it couldn't be true. We have lots of scientific ideas about how it might be true. There's roughly as many theories as there are people working in the field. There are intriguing clues, but there are also huge problems. So scientifically, it's a complete mystery, perhaps one of the greatest scientific mysteries around.
One of the greatest scientific mysteries.
It
strikes me that once, because it's a funny thing when you talk about evolution, you say, okay, we got a one-celled animal, and you say, but wait a minute, to get to that one-celled animal, there's like an infinity. There's a gap, to go from nothing to something. And then we can talk about how did that something become 2, 3, 4, 5 cells, whatever. That's one thing. But to talk about going from, whatever, proteins to, that's something that I guess, in the world in which I was raised, that's an assumption. Everybody says, oh yeah, these experiments were, done in the 50s, and it seems that there was some kind of a dishonesty there, because the real answer is we don't know. I mean, if you say, what's the scientific answer? The scientific answer is we don't know.
Yeah, so I think that dishonesty is a complicated thing, because the people in the field will all say we don't know, and they fight each other tooth and nail about that their idea might be better than the other ones. The popularizing of it, which is not always done by these people, was maybe a bit slick.
I guess that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And since I live in this world, I'm not involved in I don't hear that stuff. And most people just, you go to school and you hear this is what happened, or you get, and a lot of things are that way. I mean, the Heckel drawings in evolution or whatever, you just pick this up and you go, okay, I get it. But that to me, being able to have the humility to say we don't know would go a long way to help people in the world of science be perceived as honest or whatever. Not that I don't, but what I'm saying is that it takes humility to say we don't know. And we find, I would say, in the world of religion and in the world of science, you find a lot of people who feel like I've got to have the answers. And I think that if you don't have the answer, you don't have to have the answer.
Exactly. So I think that's probably, so the experiments that you might be these famous experiments where they put electricity in and they see. So they're kind of striking because you have these chemicals, you put electricity in, and out come certain building blocks of life. That's very surprising. You find a lot of building blocks of life on comets that come from outer space. So there's all these kinds of little clues floating around, but to go from those clues to life is a big, big, big step. So I think it's just one of the great scientific mysteries around.
Yeah.
Now, on theological grounds, do I expect that to have been a miracle? I think probably not, but I'm happy for it to have been one. I don't think I don't think a lot hangs on it.
Well, I guess we have to define miracle, and this gets to the discussion of evolution.
Yeah, sure.
You self-identify as what is called, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, a theistic evolutionist.
Sure.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, now tell us what that is. Because I have some ideas, but I don't want to pretend.
Theistic, it's a broad set of things,
Yeah.
but basically it's people like myself who think that the mechanism by which God created the complexity we see around us is one using the laws of nature rather than specific episodic miracles, as opposed to perhaps somebody who thinks that all of life just was put together in one go.
Right.
So one way I like to explain it is because it's related to the work in my lab. So if I take Lego blocks and I put them together and made you a train, it'd be pretty cool. But if I made Lego blocks that I put them in the box and I shake the box for a little while, and I shake it, and then I open it and they've all spontaneously assembled into a train, even if the train has a few little scratches on it, that might be potentially even cooler.
That's a heck of a Lego set you got
Exactly.
there.
If I could figure that out, I'd become very rich.
Yeah.
So in some sense, theistic evolutionists think that second way is the way that God created the world.
Right. Okay, but so that implies, let me say this up front just to kind of frame things, because I don't want to, again, on the popular level, the popular narrative in the culture, as I've experienced it, is that there are two ways of seeing the world. One is that God just created the whole universe a few thousand years ago, boom, there it is. The other way of seeing the universe is that there is no God, and through random processes, we got here, and we're here, and that's it. Of course, there's an infinite spectrum of possibilities in between those two poles, and those possibilities typically never get discussed. And so, going along that spectrum, you have some people that are, young Earth creationists who really do believe that everything got here, that God created everything a number of thousand years ago, that human beings were created, boom, boom, the animals were created, boom, boom, there's no evolution at all. Then, of course, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the intelligent design folks would say, we believe in evolution, but we believe that God was sort of involved at a number of stages in this process, right? But a theistic evolutionist like you would say, you believe that God created the universe in such a way that from the beginning, he just launched it, and that the evolutionary process was allowed to work, and that's how we got here. So that it was intentional and it was designed, but it was designed all the way on the front end, and then God stepped out of it.
So I wouldn't quite frame it that way.
Okay.
So maybe I'll take a step
back.
How
would you quite frame it?
So I'm to do a little bit of groundwork.
Yeah,
okay.
please.
So,
well, I'm saying these things
bear
have
with
to
me.
be corrected, and that's why I throw it out there, because that's my understanding.
So the first question, actually, is to ask yourself, when I'm in the laboratory, what am I doing as a Christian? Right? Am I studying the bits where God is no longer involved, right, when I do my physics experiments? Or what am I doing? Well, actually, I think the Bible teaches us that God sustains the world. It says that in a number of different passages. And that means not that if God were to withdraw from the world, it would slowly grind to a halt. The world would stop existing. I mean, it needs God for its very existence. So what am I then studying when I study the law of gravity or any other law in my laboratory? Well, I'm studying the ordinary ways that God sustains the world, the regular ways that God sustains the world. The question then are the regular ways that God sustains the world sufficient to describe this change over time, or does it need to be something irregular? And there's a very famous argument between Sir Isaac Newton, and Leibniz, his great kind of adversary and contemporary. And
Did they both invent calculus?
They both invented calculus, exactly. They both invented calculus. They both claimed.
That's gotta stink.
They both claimed the other one stole it from them.
Imagine inventing calculus.
Yeah.
And then your
somebody
friend
else
does the same darn thing.
Yeah.
And that's just in the same century and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, just a few years from each
Very
other.
frustrating. Very frustrating.
Exactly, yeah. So.
I hate when that happens.
Yeah, I know, it happens to me all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
So Newton, when he thought about gravity, so gravity explains, how the Earth moves around the sun, right? and how Jupiter moves around the sun. But then if you think about it, well, Jupiter is also pulling on the Earth, right? And then so is Venus, and so is Mars. And so at some point, Newton got worried, and he did his calculations, and it looks like the Earth is going to be unstable, it's going to get ejected by the solar system. Ah, said Newton, therefore God occasionally reforms the planets, okay? Occasionally, when they're about to go off
They
kilter,
get wobbly, and he gives them a
fixes
tap.
And so Leibniz objected to this on two grounds. The first one was he said, well, if you think God does that, it demeans his craftsmanship because it means that God didn't quite make it right. And his second, which I think is a kind of intuitive argument, but not necessarily a theologically profound one, but he made another very theologically profound argument, which is that he says God does miracles for wants, does not do miracles, he said, for wants of nature, but for wants of grace, which is a fancy way of saying God does miracles in redemption history for his own purposes, but not to fix things in nature. So then we ask ourselves, what is our theology of miracle detection in history? Well, it's revelation. God tells us. So now I look in the natural history, the history of the world, and how do I find miracles in the past? That's a really difficult thing to do. And it almost seems like if God had to fix things along the way, it seems like it means his craftsmanship. But I'm not saying he couldn't have done it. I'm just saying it seems theologically somewhat unsatisfying. And so we don't think that we need a special theory of how the planets move around the sun anymore. We don't think that demeans God in any way. In some sense, it's the fact that it works.
The fact that God doesn't have to give it a tap now and again, it cool. Doesn't. Right. It's really cool. It doesn't trouble our faith.
Yeah. So, and the same might be true for the way that change happened over time. And maybe another thing to say about so that's the first thing. That's the kind of groundwork. So if I think about it that way, then what we're disagreeing about sometimes is whether or not we can observe God doing stuff in the past. And I think we shouldn't be dogmatic about it, but we shouldn't hang a lot on it. The second thing to think about is, what do we mean by the word evolution? Right? And that's where it gets really, really messy. Because evolution can mean change over time, just geology. 4.5 billion years ago, there wasn't any life, now there is. Dinosaurs died out, now they're not around. There's no Tyrannosaurus Rex running up the high street. It's changed. So why, that's evolution, natural history. And we're pretty sure that happened. Patsy, the young Earth creationist, but we think that's happened over a long period of time. There's lots of evidence for it. It seems pretty solid. Then there's a question, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. Well, then there's evolution, I'll call it evolution number 2, which is Darwin's idea. So Darwin didn't come up with the idea that the world was old, that it changed. That was well known before. He just said, how did that change happen? Yeah. And then he has a theory that says there are mutations, that generates variation, that variation is selected, and that then gives you the change over time. So it's a mechanism. The problem is then there's a third kind of evolution, which we might call evolutionism, which says man is a product of a purposeless process that did not have him in mind. It's George Gaylord Simpson, a famous biologist, or Richard Dawkins. Darwin allows us to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. What those guys are doing is they're actually doing natural theology. They're looking at the natural world and extracting theological meaning from it. They're often doing it in a really naive and silly ways, along the lines of, if God acts in regular ways in the world, which is how a theist might look at it, then he must not act at all, so it's all purposeless and meaningless. Right. There's no, the conclusions don't follow from the facts. Right. So now you are your average person in the pew who believes in God. You see somebody on television, a la Richard Dawkins, proclaiming that this is what evolution tells you. Right. Well, yeah, you're going to think that's wrong, right? Yeah. And so the natural thing to do is to try to attack the science. Right. But that's the wrong way of approaching it. The right way of approaching it would be to undermine the natural theology. So Richard Dawkins and all people of that type are, I call them natural atheologians. They're looking at the natural world and trying to extract meaning from it. Natural atheologians. Yeah, because they look at the natural world, they try to extract meaning from it. Right. And so what theistic evolutionists try to do, if they do it well, is to try to not go along that route and try to show how it's actually it might point in a very different direction. So that's more or less what we would do. And so I think every Christian is a creationist. We believe God created the world. We just disagree maybe about the methods that God did. Every Christian believes in intelligent design, that God designed the world. But we don't think that we need to look for intelligent design in these kind of intricate little bits. We think it's just there everywhere. Like Francis Collins, came to faith when he saw a frozen waterfall, not because he thought it was a miracle, because it told him something about a God who cares enough about this world to make it so intricate and beautiful.
Are there no examples of what the intelligent design folks call irreducible complexity? In other words, it seems to me that there are at least a few things that would trouble somebody.
Irreducible complexity, there are lots of things that we don't understand about this evolutionary story. So we're pretty sure there was change over time, right? Yeah. We're pretty sure that mechanisms of mutations, natural selection work because we see them in the lab. In fact, your immune system uses exactly that mechanism. With that mechanism, a small number of genes can fight a very large number of pathogens because your immune system has little molecules that very rapidly mutate and that select to attack the things that it's trying to attack. So that's a mutation, selection, evolutionary kind of mechanism. So all Christians believe that God created that mechanism.
Yeah.
Where they might disagree is whether that mechanism is sufficient to describe the change over time. But scientists may, there may be some better idea that we have at some point that'll explain that better. It's all possible. It's not clear to me that that is going to give us any theological traction one way or the other, but it's perfectly interesting. So irreducible complexity is the idea that a complicated structure with many different units, it's hard to understand how that could have evolved. So I think that's a really interesting question. Right. I think it's important for scientists not to pretend like we've solved that question when we haven't. On the other hand,
because that was implied, I guess maybe it was Francis Collins when I had him, I asked him about, and forgive me if you're not familiar with this, but the sort of famous example of the flagellum that's kind of like an outboard motor type of thing. Yeah. And you look at it and you think, how did that get there? Yeah. It's so complex. But at that point, I guess he poo-pooed it as though, oh no, we've kind of solved that one, in the last 18 months or something. And I was surprised. And is that the case, or is that still a mystery?
So yes and no. So it is incredibly cool, right? So it's a little tiny motor, spins at 100,000 RPM, stop in a quarter of a turn. It's the most amazing thing. And it has all kinds of really amazing properties. So but I don't think that it didn't evolve. And the reason for that is, I think what Francis might have been referring to is that what we can sometimes do by looking at details of the proteins that make these things, we can sometimes see that something more complicated came from something slightly less complicated by following the little changes in the proteins that happen over time. It's a little bit like when I take that Lego, those Legos in the box, and I shake it, and out comes a fully formed train, I can find little scratches on it. If I'm clever, I can figure out exactly who scratched whom. So by doing that kind of who scratched whom, I have some idea of how it might have come together in the first place. And so what he's saying is, well, no, we don't have the whole story, but we have some ideas about who scratched whom, and that shows us some evidence that it did evolve over time. So the real answer should probably be, well, that flagellar motor is really cool. It's really amazing. We can see some evidence for how it evolved, but we don't know yet what the whole story is. And the thing is, if we think naively that God somehow made that flagellar motor in one go, if that flagellar motor is on the outside of a bacteria, those are bacteria that make you sick, like E. coli, right? Then that makes God into a kind of a very strange engineer who makes bacteria better at making you sick, right? It raises all kinds of other theological problems.
Actually, this brings up a really big theological problem, the little thing I like to call the fall.
Okay.
When I look at the panoply of creation and I see a scorpion or a cobra or a thing, I think in the kingdom of heaven there'll be no cobras. So people talk about God's creation, and I've often thought that, it seems that the Bible says that in the fall, we didn't just fall, but all of creation fell, so that the way things are not the way things were meant to be originally. I don't expect that there were poisonous snakes or poisonous spiders in the Garden of Eden, so that all of creation fell. And it gets very complicated, but it strikes me as sensible, this idea that we can't really know what things would, disease, bacteria, E. coli. I mean, these different things, it wouldn't seem to me that they were in the original creation, or they'll be, when everything's redeemed, that they'll be there. So it sort of complicates things.
It's a complicated question. Thank you. So I think it's a very complicated question. One of the really interesting things is that I don't think the Bible teaches that very directly anywhere.
What, that all of creation fell?
Fell, yeah. That's something that we can infer from various things, but it's not clearly there in any kind of an ambiguous way. And in fact, there are some ideas, particularly young earth creationists hold on to this quite tightly, which is the idea that it was Adam who fell and nature fell with Adam.
Well, isn't that the same thing? I don't, what?
Well, yeah, no, so, but then you can ask yourself then, where did the serpent come from, right? So why was there a tempter before Adam? So
right.
evil somehow appeared before
right.
Adam did. So why did, where did it come from?
Good question.
Yeah. So you start thinking about those things, and I think to a large extent, the Bible is silent on the origins of evil.
But
it
just getting
speaks
back
about,
to
but it
that,
speaks a lot about how to interact with it.
But it's one thing to talk about evil, but the serpent, obviously, only when it was cursed did it go on its belly, and so it was some kind of other creature that was inhabited.
But it was bad, right? It was bad, right? So we're taking
well.
Right, so people like C.S. Lewis and others believed in an angelic fall, that there was something that happened earlier.
Well, we're not gonna solve this one in the next 10 minutes, but I just think it's fascinating to kind of.
So I think one of the things I think that we have to be careful about as Christians is that we don't too quickly try to explain. We don't have an overarching explanation of things when the Bible hasn't given us that overarching explanation.
The only thing I would say is that it seems to me that if you look at the things that have the appearance of irreducible complexity, the flagellum, the eye, whatever else, to say that, okay, we don't know how it got there, but we're pretty sure based on the models that someday we'll find out. But I guess you have to wonder, is there any point at which someone would be willing to say, the evidence says that because we haven't yet found out, that perhaps it's as plausible or more plausible to believe that it is irreducibly complex, that it was
a miracle, just
created. Yeah. In other words, can you get there at some point, or does the idea that didn't happen itself become a kind of faith? In other words, that there's less, if the preponderance of evidence begins to go toward the idea that something is irreducibly complex, or enough time passes that you say we still haven't figured out, at what point do you say it would be plausible to guess that yes, in fact, that this was just created? Or I guess I want to go back to the Cambrian explosion, the same idea, right? It was that there's this idea that things are evolving and evolving, and then suddenly 530 million years ago, something. There's this huge explosion of life forms. And the intelligent design folks say, there's an example of there's no antecedent, it just happens. I'm guessing that you would say, well, it looks like it just happened, but probably there was some mechanism before that baked into the system so that at 530 million years ago, it's triggered, and then we get all these life forms. Am I roughly?
That's right, yeah, that's right. So I would say probably that is true.
Yeah.
And I think the difficulty with saying it must have been some kind of divine intervention is you need to kind of rule out all other things. Right? And so that happened a long time ago. We weren't around. We know. It's amazing that we know anything about it at all. Right. And so I think we should just think it's really cool. Right. But to say, it could have only happened by miracle when we weren't.
Well, to say it only could happen by miracle,
or that's most likely. So maybe I would say to say the most likely inference is that it happened by miracle that's a pretty big step, right?
Well, but that's what I'm saying. Is at what point?
And then I hear Leibniz whispering in my ear,
right?
God doesn't do miracles for wants of nature, but for wants of grace.
Right.
And I think, that is in fact what we see.
But see, if that is.
There's a theological argument at the end of
the day.
Right,
but that's what I'm saying. But if you buy that, And I probably do. I don't know. But I'm saying, but if you buy that, that solves the problem. That everything was baked in from the beginning, and it happened, and that was how God chose to do it.
Yeah.
And by the way, if He is sustaining things now, who's to say that that isn't a kind of intervention, except instead of happening boom here 530 million years ago and boom here and boom here when we make the flagellum, but that is happening constantly and infinitely. And so you can't slice it. You can't say, well, it happened here and then again here and then again here, but that it's always happening in various degrees. I mean, that, at that point, I think you just have to shrug because you don't know.
So here's another way of thinking about it. So if you take my example of the three different ways the universe the laws of nature may have come about, the one that I prefer, and I think as well, is that there is a necessary being who cannot not exist, who created this world. So then, clearly, God is something outside of the natural world. God is not an animal like us, only bigger and smarter, right? It's someone completely different.
Right.
So our ability to know about God is also going to be limited, which is why we're very dependent on something like revelation, which is where if you think there is something like a God who created this world, and you look around the world, its beauty, its intricacy, it seems like something like that must be true.
Yeah. Then
you wonder, well, how would this God communicate with us? So maybe I'll give you an example. So when I was a PhD student, I had a housemate who loved tropical fish, and he was a chemist. So tropical seawater fish, in fact, are actually very sensitive. You mess up the water, they die. You do the wrong food, they die. So we even used to nick stuff from the chemistry lab to measure the water and make it perfect. Spent a lot of money on them. We were PhD students, didn't have very much money. We fed them special fish and little shrimps, little flaked fish, all kind of stuff.
Right.
In spite of all our love, care, and money, every time we walked over to that tank to feed them, they'd all cower away in their little holes. So I thought to myself at some point, well, how would I communicate to these fish my love and my care and sustenance for them? Well, the only way I could do that is if I somehow became, a fish and spoke to them in fish language, whatever that is. So in some sense, if there is a God who created this world and who perhaps loved this world, then I would expect there to maybe be something like an incarnation or revelation, but that the difference between the fish and me is tiny compared to the difference between me and God. So given that that's the case, I want to be careful about assuming that God would do things in certain ways that falls outside of what He tells us about in His revelation, just because it may be really, really different.
Yeah. Wow. I have to say this has been a lot of fun for me. A real joy to have this conversation. I'm sorry we're out of time, but it's been really terrific. So a warm Socrates in the City, Oxford thank you is due for our guest, Dr. Ard Louis. Thank you very much. Thank you.